أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام رسول الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته يوم الدين ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ramadan Kareem to all of you. In this video, I'm going to focus on the fundamental concepts in the foundation of Islamic psychology. Now, if you look at this particular slides, I'm going to examine the relevance of a number of concepts that are related to Islamic psychology. However, I'm going to focus on the concept of Tawhid, Islamic worldview and its characteristics, but also on the Fitra, basically shedding some light on those basic elements that are related to human behavior and experience, but also human nature and the spiritual dimension of man. Now, most individuals would probably not associate psychological knowledge with the Quran and the Now, the science of the self or the soul was examined in the Islamic literature long before the term psychology was introduced in modern literature. In fact, the label psychologia was first used by somebody called Marco Manulik in his book Psychologia di Ratione Anima Humanae, which means, the psychology of rational animal or human. In the Physical Dictionary, for example, of 1694, somebody called Blanchard refers to psychology as treating the soul. Now, Islamic psychology, or we call it ilm an-nafs, knowledge of the self, at its core is rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. So the essence of Islamic psychology is to examine human behaviors and experience from a holistic dimension, the physical, psychological, social, spiritual, based on an Islamic, or sometimes they call it the Quranic worldview. Now, the application of Islamic psychology in clinical practice is based on Islamic healing and spiritual dimension. Now, etymologically, psychology means the science of the soul. That is, the psyche means breath, spirit, or soul. And logia, the term logia means study of or research. With the advent of the separation of science and religion and the emergence of the Western scientific paradigm, the study of the soul became redundant. Now, Islamic psychology, or ilm an-nafs, is concerned with the science of the self, or soul, or psyche, and is based on the Islamic perspective. Muslim classical scholars have used various terms to describe the concept of Islamic psychology and psychotherapy. There's various names from Tazkiyah an-Nafs to Al-Tib al-Ruhani or Ilaj al-Nafs. They all mean the psychology of the selves or the knowledge of the self. So you can see that though the focus of Islamic psychology is on the science of the soul or the self, it is more integrated within a holistic paradigm in the understanding of human nature and behavior in all in physical, social, psychological, and spiritual dimension. What is Islamic psychology? The study of the soul. It's the study of mental process and behavior. It's based on the principle of empirical psychology, rationality, intuition, observation, empirical evidence, but also on divine revelation from the Quran and Sunnah. So this definition infers that aspect of the self as well as a cognitive, affective, and behavioral process that are studied within an evidence-based paradigm that is compatible with Islamic belief and practice, as well as the Islamic sciences. Now we come to the concept of Tawheed. The concept of monotheism, known as Tawheed in Arabic, is a most single important concept, not only in Islam, but also is a foundation of Islamic psychology. Basically, monotheism is a foundation of Islamic psychology. That is a unicity or oneness of God. It is a doctrine of the unity of God, and everything in Islam is built upon. No act of worship, rituals, either it is inwardly or outwardly, has any meaning or value if this concept in any way is complete. Of course, there are three themes that preponderate in Islamic monotheism. The oneness of God in His Lordship is known as Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. The devotion of all worship to God alone is known as Tawheed al-Ibadah. And finally, the oneness of God in His names and His attributes is known as Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat. Now, I talked about Tawheed paradigm, and the Tawheed paradigm is the fundamental basis of Islamic psychology. The Islamic paradigm is very important in our faith because it's related to the Kalima Shahada. So the Tawheed paradigm gives weight to the degree and quality not only of our deeds but also of our action. Now this paradigm elevates the spirit of relationship between Allah and human being, between human beings themselves, that intra or interrelationship, and of course humankind with their environment, with other creatures. It's, in summary, we are saying that the Islamic psychology is based on the Tawheedic paradigm. Now we move on to the Islamic worldview. A worldview is a set of parameters that include a wide range of fundamental matters, including, for example, philosophy, themes, values, emotions, ethics, language, of course, culture and religion as well. It's a very subjective way of perceiving the world. It's a very subjective way of thinking or having a vision of and interacting with the world. So the Islamic worldview is principally a system of values and principle that is derived from the Quran. That's why sometimes they call it Quranic world. And the Islamic worldview is related not only to the seen world, but also to the ghaib, to the unseen world as well. Akhmetova defined worldview, but she explained it's a collection of position and attitudes and values about the world around us. So in the Islamic worldview, Tawheed is explained by the roles of the believers of the paradigm in terms of worship, in terms of ibadah, that is submission of mankind to Allah for the sake of securing His pleasure, vis-a-vis of the role of mankind as a servant and also as Khalifa, the vicegerent of Allah. Some of the characteristics of Islamic worldview are shown in this particular slides. Now, based on these characteristics, an Islamic worldview is basically ethical and monoistic world, which stem from the fundamental belief in the unity of God, in the belief in one God. And the only relation to it needs to include in the Islamic conception. Of course, this is in contrast with the worldview of secularists or atheists, where the conception of God is non-existent. And that's why famous philosopher, theologian, polymath, Al-Attas, he coined the term, the Islamic worldview as Ruwayat al-Islam li Wujud. Now, the Islamic worldview, based on the Tawhid paradigm, covers all aspects, all life of these adherents. It's based on three fundamental principles, which are Tawhid, Khalifa, and Adala, or Adl. These principles not only frame the Islamic worldview, but they also constitute the foundation of all objective, which is the maqasid, and the strategy of man in this world. In addition to the Tawhidic dimension of the worldview, there's also an ethical or moral, which is akhlaq, dimension to the Islamic worldview. Now we move on to the concept of fitra. It's an important concept in Islamic psychology because it is embedded in the human soul, or self, or nafs, and it is an essential facet in the nature of human behavior. It is worth noting that the natural inclination toward the affirmation of Tawheed, this monotheism, is inscribed in every soul. The concept of Tawheed is rooted in the metaphysical implication of the fitra. And it is true, this purification of the soul, sometimes I call it detoxification of the soul, the taskanavs, that man can actualize and fully develop their potential or actualize his fitra or her fitra. Now, this fitra sometimes get corrupted. Now, without guidance, the fitra may be corrupted or become corruptible. But important thing, it cannot be destroyed because the fitra is embedded within the multiple layer of false beliefs that we have accumulated due to the strong influence of acculturation, Western values, psychosocial factors, secular practice, cultural practice which nothing to do with Islam. All this has impinged or influenced. These layers of false belief are totally incongruent with Islamic belief and practice. And this is where the individual move away from the fitra. Or in other words, the fitra become clouded. Thus, the individual become totally alienated, cut off from the fitra. Because the purpose and meaning of life are in the service of something other than Allah. But in moments of trial and tribulations, in moments of trauma or intense people, whether you are atheist or not, you turn towards the divine for help and support. That is, the fitra is sometimes oscillates or move about between the common good and evil behaviors and practice. Allah has endowed humankind with the inborn capacity, intellect, free will to distinguish what is haram, what is halal, what is right and what is wrong, what is lawful and what is right and what is not. However, due to our social conditioning or psychosocial conditioning, the fitra get corrupted and primes humankind to evil and deviating from the teaching of Islam. This clouded fitra, as I said, become corrupted. And this degenerate, our spiritual dimension. Now, in this particular world, in contemporary society, we are constantly bombarded with immoral messages and behaviors, which mean most individuals become desensitive or they get acculturated with low ethical intelligence. In other words, the moral compass becomes suppressed, thus they embrace immorality and deviant behavior. It's worthwhile looking at what Ibn Taymiyyah said about fitra. He talked about the servants of God, that we are compelled by the fitra to love God. Now, according to him, the more knowledge we have, probably authentic knowledge we have about God, the more likely that our fitra will be less clouded. And of course, if we don't have knowledge about Islam, it's easy for that fitra to get corrupted, to get influenced, and besides Ibn Taymiyyah, you had Sheikh Salih bin Fawzan. He that the soul, if it is left upon its fitra, its natural inclination, affirms Allah's divinity, and of course has a love, for Allah, worship Allah alone, and does not commit shirk, in other words, not associate partners with Allah. However, the shaitan from the jinn and humankind corrupt and deviate the fitra. The late Aisha Uts, she talked about that in terms of crisis, when we have trial and tribulation. So during this time of trauma, trial and tribulation, we are likely to go on Allah to save us from hardship and suffering. Now, what is the role of fitra in Islamic psychology? Many roles. It's our moral compass. It's an affirmation. It's a natural inclination toward the affirmation of Tawheed. It enables us to enjoy what is good and what is haram and halal, and to forbid what is wrong. It's part of the akhlaq, part of that ethical intelligence. It is part of the development of personality. Within it's embedded the morality, the conscience, and it's also an anchor for both psychological and spiritual health. It helps us to cope with adversity during trial and tribulation, seeking help from Allah. But finally, the fitra makes humankind motive-driven. It motivates us. It motivates toward us as Muslims. We have a purpose and a meaning. Now, this is the end of the session. I hope you have enjoyed. This is a very, very brief overview of the concept relating to Islamic psychology. I look at Tawheed or monotheism as a foundation, the fitra as the Islamic worldview as very influential in the development of Islamic psychology, but finally as the fitra, which form part of Tawheed. The fitra has many roles in Islamic psychology, in understanding human behavior and experience from an Islamic perspective. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.